The Battle of Mariupol is one of the first major battles of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. This battle, which lasted 3 months, is remembered chiefly for the Siege of the Azovstal and the defiant resistance of the Ukrainians against the massive Russian military machine. However, the importance of the Battle of Mariupol and its prolonged siege was not just in its symbolism, but also in the delay of the Russian offensive operations elsewhere on the battlefield. In this video, we will be examining the Battle of Mariupol, the Siege of the Azovstal, the human suffering caused by the Russian invasion, and the strategic cost of the battle for both sides. This week, our YouTube members and patrons will be watching the first video in our series on the Russian revolutions and the Civil War, as we cover the Revolution of 1905. The support of our YouTube members and patrons allows us to continue releasing these free videos without worrying about unstable YouTube ad revenue and lets us be much more choosy in terms of our sponsors. You can join their ranks via the links in the description and get access to 2 weekly exclusive videos, more than 150 right now, including the series on the Pacific War, Fall of Sparta, First and Second Punic War, Italian Reunification Wars, Albigensian Crusade, History of Prussia, Biography of Sulla, Reconquista, World War II North African Campaign, Persian Wars, and much more. Thanks for your kind support. Before going deeper into our main topic, we have to talk about the First Battle of Mariupol, which took place in 2014 during the war in Donbass. After the annexation of Crimea by Russia and the gradual increase of control in Donbass by Russia and its proxies, Mariupol became even more strategically important. This industrial port city, lying on the shore of the Sea of Azov, was a crucial part of the land bridge from the Kremlin-controlled territories to Crimea. In March 2014, pro-Russian groups captured the Mariupol city administration and then attacked a military unit in Mariupol with petrol bombs in April. On the 7th of May, the Ukrainian National Guard liberated the city administration building, but as soon as they left the city, Mariupol once again fell under the effective control of pro-Russian groups. Only after the post-revolutionary Ukrainian government started to stabilize and hold presidential elections, Ukraine once again regained complete control over Mariupol on the 13th of June. In August, several towns east of Mariupol were captured by Russia when the Kremlin blatantly sent its armored columns into eastern Ukraine. And even though Russia and its proxies did not capture Mariupol during the 2014-22 war, the line of contact lay just 10 kilometers east of the city, which came in handy for the Russian army when it launched the full-scale invasion. The Russian attack on Mariupol actually started several days before the 24th of February, with artillery shelling, airstrikes, and even tanks shooting on Ukrainian positions to the east. On the 24th of February in the early morning, the Russians launched Grad missiles from their ships. This was followed up by cruise missile attacks, artillery shelling and airstrikes on the city, Ukrainian air defenses, and most importantly the airport, which had served several Ukrainian units stationed in the Mariupol sector as their military base and as the command and coordination center of the forces defending this sector. According to different reports, attacks on the airport had a devastating impact on Ukrainian coordination in the area, as some of the unit commanders reneged on their duties. This prompted the most experienced and prepared units in the sector, the Azov Battalion, now operating within the National Guard structure, to take over the overall command and coordination of the Mariupol sector defense. After the initial disorientation, Azov merged these units with its own troops, or transferred its troops to these units to add experience and discipline. Azov, which has been training for years under the NATO doctrine, had a formidable sergeant staff with a significant degree of command decentralization. As a result, they were ready to assume commanding positions. At the start of the battle, Ukraine had 4,500 to 5,000 troops defending the whole Mariupol sector, with some 1,800 soldiers in the 36th Naval Infantry Brigade and around 1,300 soldiers in the Azov Battalion. Other sources claim that Ukraine had 8,000 soldiers in this sector. In comparison, Russia had some 25,000 men, consisting of the 5th DPR Brigade, 9th DPR Marine Regiment, the 8th Combined Arms, consisting of the 150th Motor Rifle Division, the 102nd Infantry Regiment and 68th Tank Regiment, along with the 291st Artillery Regiment, 83rd Guards Air Assault Brigade, the 155th and 810th Naval Infantry Brigades, the 22nd and 346th GRU Special Forces Brigades, the FSB Special Units, and the Akhmat Battalion. Enjoying a huge manpower and firepower advantage, Russia went on a ground assault on the first day, but the Ukrainians mostly held their lines, besides Pavlopil and Pshevik, where elements of the 36th Brigade could not withstand the shelling, despite having fortified positions, and retreated, losing several tanks and armoured vehicles in the process. This created a wedge in the Ukrainian defence in the east of Mariupol, where the 9th DPR Marine Regiment advanced. On the shore, the Ukrainian Navy mined the entrance to Mariupol to prevent a seaborne attack on the city directly from the south. As a result, the 810th Naval Infantry Brigade had to land closer to Berdyansk. They did not meet any Ukrainian resistance in the area and eventually joined up with the Russian group advancing on Mariupol from Crimea. This indicates that the deployment point of the 810th Brigade was supposed to be closer to Mariupol. But as another Russian group was advancing quickly on Mariupol from Crimea along the shore, the Azov leadership recognized the threat and sent a group to blow up the bridges near the village of Mangush on the M14 highway leading to Mariupol. The Russian forces advancing from Crimea reached Osipenko on the 26th of February, and a day later they advanced to the outskirts of Mangush and started shelling the village. Simultaneously, tank columns of the 150th Motor Rifle Division and the DPR Vostok Battalion broke through the defences of the 36th Naval Infantry Brigade south of Volnoveka. They fought a battle with Azov on the intersection of the TO523 and H20 highways, then chose to bypass the Ukrainian defences and advanced on Kremenivka. From there, part of the Russian column advanced all the way to the Ilyich Iron and Steel Works north of Mariupol. The Russian forces were stopped at this point after taking heavy losses during this rapid march, and they did not storm the fortified positions of the Ilyich plant until mid-March. The rest of the column advanced on Nikolska. These advances from the north of the city and from the west meant the operational encirclement of the Ukrainian defenders in the sector. The remaining supply line from Mariupol was along the shore to Berdyansk, which the Russians had control of by the end of February. All supply lines into the city were under Russian control now. The Russian army encircled Mariupol after only a few days of fighting. With a rapid Russian advance from the west and the breakthrough from the north, Ukrainian forces became too stretched. As the Ukrainian defenders in the Mariupol sector now had to defend a wider front, they were forced to spread out their already understaffed units. This weakened the eastern flank of the Mariupol defense, and on the 27th of February, the DPR forces broke through from Nytova and advanced all the way to Satana, pushing back the Ukrainian 1st Marine Battalion in the process. As a result, now the Ukrainian units south of Satana also had to retreat closer to Mariupol in order to avoid encirclement. On the 1st of March, the 150th Division advanced from Nikolska, while the Russian naval infantry marching from Crimea met with them on the western outskirts of Mariupol. Being encircled, the Ukrainian units withdrew into Mariupol proper in the first week of March to avoid overstretching themselves and to force the Russians into costly urban combat. At this point, breaking the encirclement from the outside was a pipe dream, since other Ukrainian units, both in the Zaporizhia Oblast and Donbass, were busy defending their positions. Almost no help was going to come from outside. The Azov Battalion, the Ukrainian Marines, volunteers, and other defenders of Mariupol had only themselves to rely on. They had two options: surrender, giving the Russians a major victory in a very short period of time, or continue fighting to draw many Russian units to Mariupol, which Putin was so desperate to occupy. They chose the second option, using the industrial infrastructure of the city to their advantage. Russian sources say that the commander of the Russian forces in the Mariupol sector, Colonel General Mordvichev, chose to avoid attacking through the highly industrialized Kalmius district in the north of the city, instead opting for a western route via Universitetska Street and Mriu Avenue. The progress here would also allow the Russians to divide the Russian units in the Mariupol sector into two disconnected groups. On the 6th of March, elements of the 150th Division attacked the brick factory in western Mariupol. Still, they were repulsed with heavy losses by the Azov Battalion. But by the 12th of March, the 150th Motor Rifle Division and the Somali Battalion of the DPR captured the Stayi Krim settlement of Mariupol. When Mariupol was encircled, hundreds of thousands of residents were trapped inside the city under heavy and uninterrupted Russian bombardment. According to the deputy mayor of Mariupol, Serhiy Orlov, by the 2nd of March, the city was near to a humanitarian catastrophe, as water and power supplies to parts of the city were cut. Many houses were already destroyed, and food shortages were becoming a problem. On the 5th of March, the sides agreed to a humanitarian corridor to facilitate the exodus of residents. But the ceasefire did not hold on that day, as the Russians continued shelling the humanitarian corridor designated for civilians. On the 9th of March, Russia shelled the Children's Hospital and Maternity Ward. By mid-March, the situation was becoming even more desperate, as the official civilian death toll was now over 2,000 people. On the 14th of March, the sides once again reached a temporary ceasefire, which worked this time. Some 20,000 civilians, with around 4,000 vehicles, left Mariupol. But merely 2 days later, the Russians bombed the Mariupol Drama Theatre, which was the largest bomb shelter in the city. According to some estimates, more than 1,000 people were sheltering in this building, and the Russians bombed it despite a clear sign in 2 locations just outside of the building saying "children." According to the AP investigation, the death toll could be up to 600 people. Also, throughout March, the Ukrainian authorities accused Russia of deporting Ukrainian citizens of Mariupol to Russia and Russian-controlled areas, under the guise of humanitarian evacuation. Civilians, including children, were sent to filtration camps, where they were examined and interrogated by the Russian authorities to ascertain their political loyalty. Some Ukrainians would later describe these camps as having concentration camp-like conditions. Some measures were carried out in other occupied areas as well. Although probably some civilians were happy to move to Russia for political reasons, many others simply had no choice, being forced to leave Mariupol to avoid starvation and death. Ukrainian authorities claim that up to 50,000 residents of Mariupol were deported to Russian-controlled areas. This policy was the cause of the International Criminal Court indictment of Putin for the war crime of unlawful deportation of the population, children, and that of unlawful transfer of population, children, from occupied areas of Ukraine to the Russian Federation. As the Russian army gradually advanced inside Mariupol, the humanitarian situation only got worse. In late March, the Mariupol mayor, Vadim Boychenko, claimed that civilian casualties were approaching 5,000, while 40% of the buildings in the city were destroyed and 90% damaged. The surviving civilians, sheltering in the Azovstal, were evacuated to Ukrainian-controlled territory only after the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres reached a deal with Putin. At the end of the battle, Mariupol was practically destroyed. It is extremely difficult to determine the exact civilian death toll, but the Ukrainian government claims a number over 25,000. Initial Russian attempts at rapid armoured advance into the city were met with fierce Ukrainian resistance. The Russian command decided to bring additional units to overpower the Ukrainian defense. Per the Soviet/Russian military doctrine, a lot of artillery was brought, which was working on both Ukrainian military positions and the civilian infrastructure all the time, aided by regular airstrikes to wear down the Ukrainians. As we mentioned earlier, the Russian command identified the western entrance of Mariupol as a more advantageous axis of advance. On March 11th to 12th, the 150th Division and the Somali Battalion bypassed Ukrainian minefields and pushed forward from the west, towards the Zhovsnevi district along Miru Avenue, before being bogged down in urban combat. As soon as Russian units gained ground after a minor breakthrough, they would send in tanks and armoured vehicles to capitalize on the situation, but this led to heavy losses inside the urban setting. Ukrainians regularly ambushed Russian vehicles. Every building, every window, every narrow street was the Russians' enemy at this point of the battle. Within the next 10 to 14 days, the Russians' progress along Miru Avenue continued, as their forces, spearheaded by the Somali Battalion, reached Metalihiv Avenue in the city centre, while the Ukrainians had to give up their positions in the Mariupol airport, as at that point it had lost its tactical significance. The Russians continued to squeeze the ring of the Mariupol encirclement, gradually taking ground throughout the area, despite heavy Ukrainian resistance. On the 19th of March, the Russians started attacking the Azovstal, and on the following day, they demanded the Ukrainian forces in Mariupol surrender. Even though the fate of the city was sealed, street by street, house by house combat was advantageous for the defending side. This forced the Russians to bring additional units to the area, at the expense of other sections of the battlefield, where the Russian progress was not as impressive. Elements of the 19th Motor Rifle Division and more forces from the DPR, along with the Pro-Kadyrov Akhmat Battalion, were among the additional units sent by the Russian command to increase pressure on the Ukrainians in Mariupol. According to the commander of the DPR's Vostok Battalion, Alexander Kodikovsky, By mid-March, when the Russian units already had an understanding of how tough the urban siege warfare in Mariupol was going to be, and how they would have to grind their way very gradually, Chechen units decided to storm Mariupol with columns of non-armored vehicles. Predictably, they were ambushed by the Ukrainians. In the east, the Ukrainian defences resisted Russian attacks thanks to their solid defences in the Skizny microrayon, before the 810th Naval Infantry Brigade, which switched to this part of the sector after initially fighting in the west, and DPR units decided to bypass them in the north from Kalinivka and in the south along the shore. As a result, the Ukrainians had to fall back to the Livoberezhny district. In the southwest, Russian progress was more limited, as their advance from Pokrova district was halted by Azov and the 36th Marine Brigade in the Mariupol port. But by late March, the Russians advanced from the Metalihiv Avenue to the Sea of Azov. At the same time, the Vostok Battalion and other Russian units advanced in the north inside the Ilich plant, practically putting the elements of the 36th Naval Infantry Brigade and the elements of the Azov Battalion under encirclement there. At this point, Ukraine had 3 disconnected pockets of resistance, the biggest in Azovstal, then in the Ilich plant and in the port. Even before the Russian army made progress inside Mariupol, the supply issues of the Ukrainian units in this sector became a significant problem. Mariupol was encircled, and the Ukrainian army lost its supply lines fairly quickly. The Ukrainian contingent of 4,500 to 8,000 people, depending on the estimates, was in dire need of supplies. There was no way to send supplies to the encircled Mariupol defenders regularly, and the Ukrainian military at the time was just not strong enough to break through into Mariupol. However, the Ukrainian command found a way to tackle this problem to some extent in order to demonstrate to the Mariupol defenders that they were not alone. On the 21st of March, the Ukrainian Military Intelligence (HUR) launched its Operation Air Corridor. This secret mission aimed to bring in vital military and medical supplies to Mariupol, along with evacuating the most critically wounded personnel out of the city. Each flight mission was conducted by helicopters with a pilot and HUR officer on board. The role of HUR officers was to make sure that if their helicopter was destroyed, the remaining personnel were safely brought to the Ukrainian-controlled areas. All combat equipment was removed from the helicopters to fit in as much critical cargo as possible. Missions were conducted by Mi-8 helicopters flying at extremely low altitudes to avoid detection by the Russian air defense radars. Each mission was conducted by a pair of helicopters flying from the airfields in the Dnipro Oblast. The first mission delivered Starlink terminals, which improved the communication between besieged Ukrainian units drastically. All in all, 16 helicopters were sent to the Mariupol sector in 7 missions. Along with Starlink, these helicopters brought Stinger manpads, NLAW and M72 anti-tank weapons, RGW grenade launchers, mortar ammunition, 15 to 20 Mavic 3 drones, other UAVs, night vision scopes, and medical supplies. In total, 30 tons of cargo were brought to the Mariupol sector. 72 soldiers and a group of medics volunteered to be deployed in the Mariupol sector, knowing that their eventual options were extremely limited, either death or capture. 64 wounded soldiers were evacuated and brought to the Ukrainian-controlled territory, but in one case, the Russians managed to down the evacuation helicopter, killing 23 servicemen. The Ukrainians attempted more flight missions to bring supplies and take the wounded deep into the siege of Azovstal until the 11th of May, but after several successful missions, the Russians seemingly understood the tactic used in this operation and prevented further flights. Several times, Ukrainian helicopters would start their mission only to turn back as they were spotted by the Russians and fired upon. It is difficult to determine the exact impact of the audacious Operation Air Corridor on the Battle of Mariupol, but it definitely boosted the morale of the besieged Ukrainian fighters, along with saving the lives of dozens of wounded. Improved communication and military supplies also somewhat enhanced the Ukrainian fighting potential in the sector, and probably bought the Mariupol defenders a few more weeks. By early April, the Russian advance from the north and the west had effectively divided the Ukrainian defenders in the Mariupol section into 3 separate pockets of resistance. On April 3rd to 4th, more than 250 soldiers of the 501st Battalion of the 36th Brigade, fighting in the Ilich pocket of resistance, surrendered to the Russians. A week later, the commander of the 36th Brigade, Vladimir Bereniuk, went against the decision of the Azov, which at the time was the de facto commanding unit of the Mariupol defense, and decided to break through to the north, instead of breaking through to the south to join with the rest of the Ukrainian units. According to the Ukrainian intelligence officer Ilya Samoilenko, the commander of the 36th Brigade took a small group of working tanks, armoured fighting vehicles and ammunition, along with most of the soldiers of this brigade. The commander of Azov and the de facto commander of the Mariupol defense, Denis Prokopenko, stated that the commander of the 36th Brigade decided, without warning anyone, to simply make a breakthrough in an unknown direction and thereby lost many people. Also, many people were left to their fate, and they were simply captured. If this had not happened with this brigade, we would have been able to keep the defense on the right bank for a long time. But the flank was exposed, and after the completion of the clearing of the Ilyich plant, the enemy threw all their forces in our direction. This allowed them to attack us from the flank and rear. This was a major blow to already struggling Ukrainian defenders suffering from shortages of supplies. Most of the column was destroyed by the Russian artillery, but Ukraine later awarded a 32-year-old Lieutenant Colonel Oleg Gruzevich for getting back to Azovstal with 15 soldiers of the 17th Tank Brigade after reportedly walking 175 kilometers for 10 days through Russian positions. On April 12th, another group of Ukrainian Marines of over 1,000 men surrendered to the Russians simply because they ran out of food and ammunition. The rest of the 36th Brigade and the remaining units in the Ilyich plant resistance pocket broke through to the south to Azovstal. On the 15th of April, the units in the Mariupol port area pocket of resistance also broke through to Azovstal, losing dozens of men and all their vehicles, while the Russians completed the capture of areas around this massive industrial area. By the 20th of April, the Ukrainian resistance was now active only in Azovstal. The Azovstal Iron and Steel Works was a Soviet-era industrial behemoth lying on the shore of the Sea of Azov. It consisted of several plants and industrial enterprises for a total size of some 10 square kilometers. Azovstal had a vast area of bunkers and tunnel infrastructure, and even before the Ukrainian resistance was reduced to this area, many civilians took shelter from the Russian bombardment there. On the 18th of April, the city authorities reported that 1,000 civilians were still in Azovstal. It is difficult to tell the exact number of Ukrainian soldiers besieged in the Azovstal, but Zelensky's later statement about the capture of 2,500 Ukrainian fighters, including many wounded, indicates their number. In a televised speech on the 21st of April, Putin ordered Russian troops to block off the Azovstal instead of storming it, and declared the capture of Mariupol. Several Russian units were redeployed from Mariupol. The Russians increased the pace of their airstrikes and shelling to inflict further damage on the remaining Ukrainian soldiers. Bunker buster bombs were regularly launched. Even Tu-22 strategic bombers were used during the siege. Contrary to Putin's public statements, Russian forces conducted ground assaults, but their progress was minor. By the 7th of May, the evacuation of all citizens from Azovstal was completed, and now only Ukrainian soldiers remained. Their situation was horrible, and was getting only worse every day. They were calling on the Ukrainian government and the international community to ensure a ceasefire and their evacuation, but Putin was not going to let the Azov battalion leave for propaganda reasons. Finally, after almost 3 months of fierce resistance, which went down in history, the remaining Ukrainian soldiers laid down their arms on the 16th of May. Hundreds were captured. Despite heavy losses, Russia finally occupied Mariupol. The capture of Mariupol is arguably Russia's most significant accomplishment in this war so far. The Kremlin has reached its goal of getting a land bridge to Crimea. On the other hand, it took the Russian army 3 months to complete the capture of Mariupol, which prevented at least 25,000 Russian soldiers busy in this sector from being deployed elsewhere. They could have been used to deepen Russian progress in the Zaporizhia Oblast, increase Russia's chances of faster advances in Donbass, or create a more threatening situation for Mykolaiv. Instead, the Ukrainian defenders bogged them down in costly urban warfare, buying crucial time for the rest of the Ukrainian army. Their resistance turned into the symbol of Ukraine's defiance against Russian aggression. Although Russian authorities and the propagandists threatened to convict and execute the defenders of Mariupol, hundreds of them returned home in prisoner exchanges, and many continued fighting the Russians. More videos on the Russian invasion of Ukraine are on the way, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Recently, we have started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.